Okay. I read this book for the first time when I was 18 years old in my freshman year of college. I am now 22. I graduated last May. And out of the blue, I decided to reread this book. This is a very famous novel. I'm certainly not the first person to talk about it. I've never seen someone on like YouTube talk about it. But it's a known piece of literature. But I felt like I needed somewhere to like unpack my thoughts because it's such a strange little book. And I think there's so many different ways to go about analyzing it. There's so many different paths to take. And I think what makes this book so genius and what makes it deserving of the Nobel Prize in Literature is that there's no wrong analysis. There's no wrong take, obviously within reason. When I first read this book when I was 18, I was really thinking about it as a philosophical examination of the self. What does it mean to be a person, an individual? And I don't think that's a wrong interpretation. I don't think like this is a situation where when I was 18, I was an idiot and I didn't understand the book, and now I'm 22 and I understand it. Like, no, I was a smart 18-year-old. I was in college. Like, I got it. But I just see it really differently now. I still think it's about that. I still think it's about humanity and identity and all these things. But I also think on a sociological level, as an examination of society, as an examination of the roles that we assign ourselves. And I think it's interesting on a more like existentialist level, like how much does anything we do matter? And if it doesn't matter, should we still do it? My back hurts. I shouldn't have sat on the floor for this. Okay, let's get into it. I'm gonna start here. I think if you haven't read the book and you're not really down to like Google it, I can give you a very brief synopsis. I don't think you should watch this video because I'm just going to talk in depth about everything that happens, especially the ending. And I think more than almost any other book on the planet, this is a book where you should go in knowing nothing. So that being said, like, stop watching. But if you need like one sentence to know what it's about, if it sounds like it might be up your alley, Never Let Me Go is a novel, 2005 novel. It is speculative fiction about young people who grew up at a special boarding school. And that's about as much information as you should have going into it. If you like philosophy, if you like speculative fiction, if you like science fiction, no, I won't even say that, because yes, it is a work of science fiction on a very technical level, but it's not genre fiction. It's very much literary fiction. But it's not difficult to read. So if you're like scared of big books and you think like, oh, Nobel Prize winner on the front is like scary to you, it's a short book. The language is not dense at all. The ideas are kind of dense, but not hard to unpack. And if you want to read the book and then come back and like watch me blabber on about the ideas and maybe like generate some ideas of your own, like, I would love that. That'd be so great. I don't even know who is watching this. I don't think this is going to get any views. I would like to have this as a record for myself. And I think even the fact of that sort of ties in with the ideas of this book, which, by the way, I did finish reading 20 minutes ago before I sat down to do this. And I planned to do this yesterday. So like I just hit the mic. I have no script. I have no plan. Like, I really just want to blabber. And I'll just cut out anything and we'll fix it all in post, as they say. And thank God this is my editing and not a reality show, because they could just cut anything together and make me look stupid. If you read the book and you kind of remember what it's about, but you want a brief plot summary, here it is. And so like from this point on, I'm going to just be assuming you've read the book and I'm going to spoil it, or that you don't care. So our protagonist is Kathy. She is, when we meet her, 30 years old, 31, and she's working as a carer. It's her job to assist in the recovery process of donors, and the way that the system works is clones make 4 donations and then they complete. and Kathy's been a carer for a very long time. She grew up at a boarding school, we'll say, called Hailsham, which was, we're told, was like the nicest option for homes for clones to grow up in. And there she became best friends from early childhood. She was best friends with Ruth, and then when she was a little bit older, she became very good friends with Tommy. And those are the two other main characters of the book. And so the story kind of follows Kathy reminiscing on her time at Hailsham, her friendships with Ruth and with Tommy, the dynamics between the three of them, and also sort of remembering like little quirks about Hailsham, like stories that spread around her year, or like nicknames they would have, or even just like the rules of games they would play. And it's very much like a portrait of a little microcosm of society. After Hailsham, that's all like part one of the book. Part two of the book follows their journey when they leave Hailsham and they go to the cottages, which is sort of this post-school home for them to live in with other clones from all over England or all over the UK, to like live together. And they're technically supposed to be writing these essays, but the essays don't really matter. And they're getting their training to be carers, because every donor starts as a carer before they become a donor. And you just sort of pass some time here until they call you up to be a carer. And then part three is Kathy as a carer, and she reconnects with Ruth and Tommy, who are both donors, and she it cares for both of them as they finish their donations and complete. There's a sort of a twist, but it's not even really a twist. But she has sort of a confrontation with the former headmaster or headmistress of Hailsham, and they sort of talk about like certain things that had been like left, like unraveled threads that get loose threads that get tied up before the end of the book. And at the end of the book, both Ruth and Tommy have completed, and Kathy is about to finish her last year as a carer before becoming a donor. And we know that that means that she's going to complete within like the next couple of years. So that's like the brief overview. I think if you read the book, then you kind of remember that like the structurally, a lot of it is told in these sort of like meandering flashbacks, and it really does mimic human thought patterns, like the way that we'll just sort of drift from one thought to the next, and like one story will make us remember this other story and all this stuff. And Kathy is telling us things with a very like high context relationship to the reader. And she addresses us directly a few times, and she's like, I don't know how it is where you were, but at Hailsham, and that sort of thing, which gives us the impression, I guess, like that we are very much a part of this world, that we might even be clones ourselves, because I guess no one else would really care to hear her story, based on like what we learn about the way clones are thought of in this society. I think one thing that I find really special about this book is how much love and craft is dedicated to developing Hailsham as a world. Even though the system of like what clones are and how they came to be and how they function and like how people think of them and all this stuff, it's sort of touched on, but it's really very underdeveloped, which is not important at all to the story. And that's why I hesitate to call this science fiction. Because the world building isn't really there. And it is very much supposed to be like our world, except that there's clones. And it's not really a developed idea, because, that's more of like a concept to get us from point A to point B and not really the point. But so much time and dedication is taken to develop Hailsham, which is this, which doesn't even survive the novel. Like everything else in the novel, it too passes on, it dies. Hailsham closes at some point in Kathy's adulthood. But we learn so much about how people behaved, about what their daily schedule was like, about what their art classes were like, about what was valued, what was considered sacred. Learning about the exchanges and the sales, like what people earned tokens from doing different activities and from making good pieces of art. So there is even there's like a monetary system to this school. And at the exchanges and the sales, people would spend their tokens to get items. And that really shows like there is a system of value, an economic system at this place. Like this school is really a microcosm in the very pure sense. And I like the idea that Ishiguro wants to examine a world where the people, the characters, although they are not even seen as fully human, they are treated with, at least at Hailsham, a high level of respect. These aren't abused kids. We kind of get this sense from other characters in the novel that if you weren't at Hailsham, you might have had it really rough, that there are homes or places where these kids or these clones are being raised where they're being abused and treated as really less than human. And Hailsham, we find out, is this like privately funded experiment. Of course it's privately funded. This privately funded experiment on like what would happen if we treated them like people and we raised them to be people. Even though at the end they're still going to do what they were made to do. And even though the people who are raising them, the guardians, still can't quite see them as fully human. I like that experiment. It's pretty rare, I would say, for like this sort of near dystopian fiction world. This idea of like, okay, in a system where we are with the most privileged of the underprivileged, we are with the most lucky of the unlucky. What does that look like? I really like that. I think it gives them a lot of dignity as characters and also lets us really explore their humanity, which of course is the point of the story. I think what's something that really struck me this time around reading it was when we find out that Hailsham was nothing more but like a privately funded like experiment to see if a humane approach would be better, that as the government turned more conservative, shout out Margaret Thatcher, people lost interest and people just wanted to stop thinking about the clones altogether. When we find all of this out, we also find out that like, yes, society at large doesn't really see them as people because they've been kept in the shadows and like they just don't even really know about them and they don't want to know about them and they don't want to think of them as human because that would make them have to confront the horrible things that they're doing. But also the headmistress, Miss Emily, and also Madame, and all the other guardians, it's very clear to me when we have that conversation at the end with Miss Emily that even she doesn't really see them as people. And I wonder sort of like if the story were told from someone else's perspective, if maybe we were getting it from one of the guardians' perspectives, like if we saw the entire book from Miss Lucy's perspective, or yeah, whatever, Miss Geraldine, would we have a hard time fully recognizing Kathy and Tommy and Ruth as people? As it is, their humanity is very obvious to us. We are literally existing inside of Kathy's head, and we exist and we have this very intimate connection to her and all of her friends because they're the only people she knows. They're the only world she knows. It's so intimate, and it's such... Ishiguro is so good at very quietly capturing relationships. I think so much of their relationships kind of go unsaid, especially the way that Kathy will minimize herself for Ruth and will put other people's happiness above her own, almost pathologically, which is why she's such a good carer, of course. I think an example of this, well, one of my favorite moments in the book, which I think ties into this really well, is when they're all in Norfolk. How would a British person say it? Norfolk. I'm gonna say Norfolk. All in Norfolk, and Tommy is like, oh, I've been thinking about how nice it would be to find oh my god, Kathy lost this tape that she had, which the title of the book comes from this tape. This tape is like a very important item in the book, and sort of in each of the three parts it comes up in a major way. So in the first part we have Kathy buying it at a sale. It's just like this music tape from 1950s like lounge songs, and it has a song on it called Never Let Me Go that she loves, and whenever she gets a moment alone she'll listen to it, and kind of never got like any kind of resolution to that. Like it just goes missing. Probably someone stole it, but we don't know. In part 2, we find out that Tommy knew that the tape went missing and that he looked everywhere for it when they were in school, when they were at Hailsham. And now that they're in Norfolk, he wants to find it for her. So they actually end up at this like secondhand store, and he tells her that like even more than finding the tape, what he had thought about for years and years was how she would react when he gave it to her, and just like the act of giving her the tape and how happy she would be. And that he had thought about that for years. And that's just so good. His love language is gift giving. That is very much Tommy's love language, is gift giving. I would say, yeah, Tommy's love language is gift giving. Ruth's is quality time. Think about it. And Kathy's is acts of service, for sure. Anyway, yeah, that moment really sticks out to me. It's so quiet and intimate. And it's the sort of thought that you have that in the tiniest way proves that you're alive. And it's a thought that you could share with your best friend who you're in love with. But if you didn't share it with the other people, how would they know that you're alive? Like if you're a clone and you're going around having thoughts and feelings and an imagination and a soul, but you have no way of proving it, how do you prove that? That's a really interesting thing. So art takes on this life in the novel, where all these kids are told to produce so much art, and it even becomes part of their social dynamic. Kids who don't really have much creativity or artistic talent are mercilessly bullied. Tommy is bullied a lot as a kid because he's just not very talented artistically. And because the guardians have told them making art is so important, the kids have taken it upon themselves to sort of socially rank each other based on their artistic talents. And that even plays into their economy because they can buy each other's artwork at the sales, or at the exchanges. That was another interesting facet. And so the guardians are very gung-ho about them making like a ton of art, because Madame, what she's doing is she takes all the student artwork and they try to show it to, I guess, the government or whoever is like running the cloning program. They try to show it to them to prove that these kids have souls, because if they didn't have souls, how could they make good art? Which is a very interesting argument. And I don't disagree with it, I guess. Yeah. I don't think if you didn't have a soul, well, the concept of souls is so religious anyway. What is a soul in a non-religious context? Because these people don't have religion. Like, they don't even consider completion isn't death, because they're not even really supposed to be people. And so if they were people, they would die, but they don't die, they complete. So then how could they have souls? Like, it's so good. You see, well, like, I needed to sit down and talk about it because things just keep coming to me and I just wanted to talk. I've been recording for 25 minutes. Okay, that's not even that bad. I want to talk about Ruth. I think when I first read this book, I was very happy to, like, hate Ruth. I think that's so easy to do. And this time around, maybe because I'm older than her character is, in the second part, they're like 17, 18, and I was 18. And that's when a lot of the stuff with Ruth happens. And so I found it very easy to just hate her. And now I'm a little bit older than her, but also I'm reading differently. I used to get in trouble in middle school and high school English class because if I had something to say about like a character, it was hard for me to get past my like emotional reaction to the character. Very online pilled. But basically I would be like, oh, this guy's annoying, I hate him, X, like, don't want to think about him. And I remember a lot of my teachers being like, okay, but what's the point of him being annoying? Because the author didn't make him annoying unintentionally. Thought I saw a bug. Okay, I think it's so easy to write off Ruth as this like annoying, grumpy teenage girl. It's so interesting how each of these three main characters have some quality about them that makes them have a distinct personality and character flaws and things that they should work on. So like Tommy has these horrible temper tantrums that come from the bullying, and in part encourage the bullying because people want that reaction from him. And then eventually he gets them under control, and he ends up becoming like a very well-liked kid. Ruth is incredibly manipulative. She's a pathological liar, and she really needs attention and approval from others. Kathy has almost no backbone, and she's just sort of a doormat. This bitch, like, she lets herself kind of be walked all over, and in the end it doesn't matter. And that's my grand point, is all three of these characters have these like flaws that, you know, you'd think that they should work on, and that over the course of the novel they do work on. They all go through character growth. Ruth eventually tries to make amends. Tommy gains control of his temper, and Kathy, I guess, kind of manages to like go for what she wants. Yeah, she does. She's the one who sort of initiates them going to Miss Emily. So yeah, she kind of learns to take control of what she wants. There is character growth, but in the end, of course, none of it matters because they're clones, and their entire design is to donate their vital organs and then die, and be like guinea pigs for science experiments. So it's interesting that, well, there's a section in this book when Ruth is talking to Miss Emily, and they're talking about how there was all this, you know, they had school lessons. They learn history, they learn science, they learn about, like, they'd go through normal schooling, and they had this huge emphasis on making art. And Kathy talks about when she meets Miss Emily again as an adult, and she finds out that there's nothing special really about Hailsham besides that she just got lucky that they were so nice to her there. And that there's nothing special about the clones, that her existence came at a specific time in the political history of England, specifically this topic, and the tides have already turned, and Hailsham's over. And she asks this question, I can't remember if it's her or Tommy, one of them asks this question. They say, why Hailsham at all? And Miss Emily says, you know what, that's a really good question. Why Hailsham at all? And I think as a reader, we can go larger than that. Why this book? Why write a book if in the last 20 pages we find out that these characters are unimportant, the environments are unimportant, Hailsham's unimportant, all of it is unimportant, their existence is unimportant, and the political topic isn't even making major headway. There isn't any real sense of progress happening because the people who, you know, the humanity experiment stopped getting funded. So we've actually even slid backwards, which feels so relevant. Why write a book about, and even more than that, if you're going to write a book about this, why wait until the last 20 pages to make that reveal after spending 260 pages creating very well-developed characters who have flaws, who have needs, who love each other, who fight with each other, who care for each other? Why do it? I think it's, you know, again, the futility of it. I guess you could extrapolate all this into making sort of a larger argument about art. Art in this book, as I said, is super important because the guardians use the art of the students to prove that they have souls. And Kathy and Tommy are convinced for a time that art is a way that you can show if two people are really in love, as if their art is, you know, I guess similar to each other or something. I think, and then if we take like the larger question of like, why even write this book? Well, why even make art? Art itself can be sort of futile. It can be used for political ends. Obviously, good art should be and is political. Debate topic for another time. But like, why make art at all? It's sort of futile, but it's this like natural human urge. Any art history or film class I had ever took in college usually started with us looking at cave paintings. Let me look it up. There's these cave paintings. There's this one site called Cueva de las Manos. Why do I say it like that? There's this one site, Cueva, I speak Spanish. Cueva de las Manos in Argentina. Shout out Argentina. Which I'll put a picture, but it's these hands, it's a bunch of handprints, and it's like clearly like a community art project. It literally makes me want to cry every time I look at it. The indomitable human spirit. the human spirit. We have this natural urge to make art, even if it's futile, even if it's just hands on a wall that makes, who knows why they did that. I would bet you a lot of money that they didn't do it for any like useful utilitarian purpose. They did it because they wanted to. And the fact that it's like so many hands, maybe it's even like generations. We don't really know. I don't think there's much known about it. It's so beautiful, and why make this? Like, why? Like, but there's just this urge to do it. And I think it's like, okay, we make these clones that are meant to do vital organ donation. They're too human. They're basically they are all but human beings. They can't reproduce. Does that mean that they're a separate species? Okay, oh, that's what it is. Mules are not considered a special species because they are infertile. So these aren't a separate species. Okay. The characters of this novel, the clones, are not a separate species. Okay, so you have these clones, and they're human, right? We know that, even if people who aren't clones don't know that. Another really reason why it's sort of genius that Kathy addresses us directly as though we know is because she operates under the assumption that whoever she's telling her story to would have to be like her, because no one else would care except for clones or people directly involved, like guardians. No one else would care, so we must be a clone. Anyway, these people exist, and even if they only exist to do one thing, but you have to raise them first. They have to grow up first, and they have minds, and they have hearts, and they have souls, so they do things anyway. Even though it's completely futile, they can't help it. And it's the same thing as us, as regular human beings, having urges to do things that don't matter, that have no material effect. In fact, our lives in general, the individual's life, doesn't really have a material effect on the world around them. It's only when we join together as like a mass of people that we can make any sort of meaningful change. That doesn't mean that my individual life doesn't matter. Even if I never do anything that leaves a lasting impression, even though the people that hurt me and the people that I hurt and the things that I do that are wrong and the cars that I crashed, not that I've ever crashed a car, and the food that I eat and the body that I live in, all of it, none of it really matters, but I still do it anyway. And that's this book. Which brings me to AI art and what's so sinister about it. AI art, I wonder how the characters in this novel would react to AI art. It doesn't have a soul. I think honestly, if I had to make an argument about these students being, human with souls, I would just compare their work to like any AI generated piece of art. Just, that stuff is so creepy and so gross. And it's interesting that the people who make it, like the coders, like they would, why do we want it? I don't think anyone wants this stuff. It's so, why does it exist? It's so weird. It's hard not to think about this book in my current political landscape. It's September of 2024. And even though this it was written in 2005, and if I think about what was happening in 2005, I think it was probably around this time that, like, I remember they, like, cloned a sheep brain, I think in the 90s or something. I should research, but... And IVF was becoming more popular. Now that we're reaching sort of a very critical point in IVF, at least in the US, with IVF, I think it's really interesting to read this book now. If I think about the fact that, like, the Republican Party in many states is trying to ban IVF because it's unnatural. And we even have a candidate for vice president who part of his platform is that IVF is unnatural and that it shouldn't be allowed. And like, if you can't naturally conceive, then you are like a bad person. And this sort of like control over women's bodies, that's becoming more and more like mainstream again. It's really interesting to think about this book because these are test tube babies. They're clones, they're not naturally born, and they can't reproduce themselves. So it's really interesting seeing like the panic about IVF right now, and then thinking about this book and these characters. I want to talk about Kathy too. I don't even think I really even finished talking about Ruth, that I was just trying to give her more grace when I read the book this time, and it was difficult at parts. She's awful, but I also I think something that is really clear about Ruth's character is how scared she is and how much she wants to be liked and how much she wants to be accepted. And it's so interesting reading it. I think reading it for the first time, you get even more emotionally invested. I think reading it the second time is a completely different experience. Everything is sort of tinged with this tragedy. You don't know how little they matter until you get to that scene with Miss Emily. That confrontation. You don't realize what their role is, really. You know they're separate and you know that they have limited options, but you don't really know. You know as much as the characters do. Reading it the second time and knowing everything, knowing the full scope of things, this tragedy sort of affects everything in the same way that, like, Kathy describes when she finally begins her relationship with Tommy and becomes this carer. The end of the book, their relationship is tinged with this like deep tragedy and mourning because they know that it's already too late. And when they lose hope of having a deferral and being together, their relationship basically ends. And I felt like that reading the book. So every time Ruth is acting like a massive bitch, it was easier for me to like feel for her because I was like, she just wants to be loved and she's scared and none of it matters. And that's like the sickest and saddest part. And it's like, even if Kathy and Tommy had been allowed to like be together, like if Ruth had like stepped aside and let them be together when they were younger, it all would have ended the same way. It's so like let's talk about Kathy. Okay, one thing I really liked, I'm gonna find this section. I found this section I want to talk about. It really stuck out to me this time. I'll just read the passage. Oh yeah, so Kathy is at Hailsham. She's about 15 or 16 at this point, and she stumbles upon Miss Lucy, who is a guardian, doing something very strange that I kind of still don't understand. She's scribbling over a piece of paper that someone has written on like with very nice penmanship in blue ink, and she's scribbling it over with pencil so that it looks like this dark gray, like shiny piece of paper. And why is she doing that? I don't know. In those days, I had this secret game. When I found myself alone, I'd stop and look for a view out of a window, say, or through a doorway into a room. Any view, so long as there were no people in it. I did this so that I could, for a few seconds at least, create the illusion the place wasn't crawling with students, but that instead Hailsham was this quiet, tranquil house where I lived with just 5 or 6 others. To make this work, you had to get yourself into a sort of dream and shut off all the stray noises and voices. Usually you had to be pretty patient, too. If, say, you were focusing from a window on one particular bit of the playing field, you could wait for ages for those couple of seconds when there wasn't anyone at all in your frame. Anyway, that's what I was doing that morning after I'd fetched whatever it was I'd left in the classroom and come back out onto the 3rd floor landing. This really sticks out to me. I think because it's something that I could see myself doing when I was that age. I feel like being 15 and being like, I would like so like feeling so intensely like the presence of everybody else in the world is difficult. That's an aspect of being like a teenager that I feel like, and I think it's almost in like, it's not that it becomes less difficult, it's just that we sort of get used to it. I feel like when you're younger, you're sort of like blissfully unaware of like the other people and like, except if they're in your immediate like interaction. And then when you're like 12 or 13, you start to realize like how many people there are in the world and how they're all very different. And I think that's like when a real loneliness sets in, sort of like awareness of your own small individual self. And like I think that's why teenagers probably want to spend so much time alone. I remember like I needed so much I still need alone time, but like I needed so much alone time as a teenager, even though I've always been very extroverted, because like it's just the enormity of like in the scale of the world starts to hit you. So anyway, I don't know, this game that she plays, like, it really makes sense to me. It's, like, something I could have seen myself doing. I also think, like, if you think about her as a character in context, like, she's a clone, and it's, again, a very small moment, and Ishiguro is so good at these small moments where, like, humanity just shines through. That is such an, innately human behavior. And it's so simple and so, like, affecting. And I think that's what makes his writing so brilliant, even though the language is so simple and so spare. And this is something that, like, kind of sticks with Kathy. She tells us at one point that when she's living in the cottages, she gets a habit of going for really long solitary walks. Oh my gosh, it's getting dark out, isn't it? I bet this lighting looks terrible now. And we know that as a carer, she spends hours alone in the car, which she doesn't really seem to mind. She's alone sort of like with her own imagination and her own memories. And she likes driving around a lot. And she knows like every road in England, which how many are there? Like 4? A joke. I find this really interesting. And I also find it interesting that like Kathy grew up in Hailsham. Like she's never been alone. She, until she's a carer, never really spends much time by herself, which I guess is true for a lot of kids. I spent a lot of time alone as a kid. My parents both had jobs. Like I feel like I just spent a lot of time like playing alone in my room as a kid. Having the time of my life. But there are some kids that grow up and like literally never spend a second alone, and like I'm friends with them and like they turn into like the most energetic adults. It's interesting. Kathy is one of those people. She grows up in a community, and yet she still has this like human need for like individuality and like aloneness and like this sense of her self as separate from others. I find this is, again, as I said at the very beginning, that is mostly what I took away from this book when I was 18 and I read it for the first time, was this sense of like the human as an individual and like how important it is to feel your individuality. Anyway, I think like the idea that Kathy needs, that part of being human is a need to like separate yourself from others and feel a sense of like interiority, is very interesting and like a huge part of this novel. I also think like the conceit of this novel relies on like a Western conception of individuality. These people are created in service to others, in service of a larger task. You could make an argument, I think, especially coming from like a more community-based, like socialist viewpoint, or a more like Christian or a monotheistic religious viewpoint, that this would give them a sense of purpose, because they were literally created for the goal of serving others and like created to fulfill a purpose, and they're forced to do that no matter what. So the idea that this would like that should give them a sense of purpose, but obviously it doesn't really, and maybe it would if they'd been like sort of been told the full truth, but they aren't told the full truth. And I think they aren't told the full truth because people know that it wouldn't really help them. Maybe it's because like they don't feel called to donate all their vital organs, they are just forced to do it. But anyway, the concept of their individuality and like the tragedy of them not being allowed to live in exactly the way they want, that they don't have any options, is very Western. I don't disagree with it necessarily. It's just something I'm pointing out. I'm not necessarily saying like this Ayn Rand, like we should all just strive for like complete individuality and like never worry about other people. No. I think part of the beauty of this book is like the struggle for individuality is, and I think also that's why they have these long scenes about their possibles, like the people that they could have been cloned off of. And it's so important to them that, to Ruth, it's very this idea that her possible would be a woman who works in an office, as she is someone who like would love to work. She would love to be a corporate girly. And you know what? Ruth would be an amazing corporate girl boss. It's actually such a tragedy that she never got to work in an office. My girl never got to work a 9-to-5 a day in her life, and imagine how good this girl would be in the corporate sphere. Hello, Morgan Stanley? Like, call her up. Anyway, Ruth really wants to work in an office, and so when her friend says that he's seen her possible, like the person she could have been cloned off of, working in an office, that means so much to her that it actually crushes her when she finds out that it's not true. And I think the possibles are a way of them separating themselves from each other, because they are all grown in this like clump together. So they each have a possible, and that's sort of like real evidence of their own individuality, that like they each come from distinct different people who have different paths, even though they all have the same path and they all behave the same way and are like raised in the exact same manner. I think that's like why that's so important to them as a concept, in part, even though they know it's sort of ridiculous. Yeah, anyway, I think the really beautiful balance in this book is how much that individuality is like seen as necessary and like tragic that they can't have it, but also, again, like I said, Hailsham as a place is crafted so lovingly and given so much attention. He clearly has like an understanding of the importance of community the stories we tell ourselves in order to live, hashtag Joan Didion, the environments we craft for ourselves, and the way that like we function in societies, even at small places. And I think all of us are part of community and like micro societies. Having just graduated college, I think that's something that I'm thinking about a lot. It's like all this knowledge I have about this place where I lived for 4 years, where I became more and more with every passing day entrenched in the culture. Now I'm out of it and I will never be back in that space, and most of that knowledge is useless to me. And I think that's sort of like how Kathy thinks about like Hailsham, even though Hailsham is closed and she'll obviously never go back there, and most of the people she knew have completed. All those memories are still really important to her, and like my memories of college are still really important. It's tiny little things, they're important to me as they're important to all people. And like this idea that we all exist in spaces, and when we exist, the smaller your space is, the more you're gonna come up with its own like mini society. I mean, it's the same principle that gets like cults functioning. Like a huge level aspect of cults is language, and like the way that they create their own language. There's a really good book on that called Cultish by Amanda Montell, if you would like to check it out. Like, we'll know more. She also has a podcast. Oh my god, I've been talking for an hour. Okay, I gotta wrap it up. I wanted to get into another quote I really like. Let's go into quotes that I really liked. Okay, so Kathy is describing the care center where Tommy lives, and it's a converted sort of like resort, and they've filled in the swimming pool area with cement, but they didn't remove the diving board. And she says, of course, the pool's filled in now, but the outline's still there, and they've left standing at one end an example of this unfinished atmosphere, the metal frame for the high diving board. It was only when I saw the photo it occurred to me what the frame was and why it was there, and today, each time I see it, I can't help picturing a swimmer taking a dive off the top only to crash into the cement. The imagery there just hits me so hard. I think that also speaks to this like feeling of futility and like crashing hope. This book is a downer. I just loved that. I just wanted to share that. And then I like to underline things in pencil. I'm not a huge annotator. I only underlined one sentence, and it was very small and has almost nothing to do with like the actual plot, because I just really liked the sentence. I really liked the metaphor of it, and now of course I can't find it. Let me give context. Kathy is talking about her and Tommy's relationship when they sort of like get together, even though it's over. Like there's no time for them to really be together, and that's like the major tragedy. And she's sort of describing how like it feels like this like sad thing, and I think that's sort of like the experience of rereading the book. It's like, you know, that there's no hope for these characters, so like everything gets a little bit more melancholy and like colder. No, it's still such a warm book. It's so strange. It's such a sad book, but it's so warm, and I think that's because like the characters just like are so intertwined and like so intimately drawn. Anyway, so yeah, she's describing that, and she talks about how like the window in Tommy's room is not like a good way. It's like very high up, and it's like stained glass or like clouded glass. Like it's supposed to be a bathroom window. She's talking about the relationship and how it feels like too late for them. Maybe it was to do with that room, the way the sun came in through the frosted glass, so that even in early summer, it felt like autumn light. That's such a good line! The imagery there is beautiful, the metaphor is beautiful, just like this idea of a relationship that is happening too late, that can't really grow, that the chance for them really already passed, describing that as autumn light. This is why existential bitches love fall. And then the last thing I wanted to point out was at the very end when she's saying goodbye to Tommy. He tells her this very, very silly thing. He says, "When I used to play football back at Hailsham, I had this secret thing I did. When I scored a goal, I'd turn round like this." He raised both arms up in triumph, "and I'd run back to my mates. I never went mad or anything, just ran back with my arms up like this." He paused for a moment, his arms still in the air. Then he lowered them and smiled. "In my head, Kath, when I was running back, I always imagined I was splashing through water. Nothing deep, just up to the ankles at the most. That's what I used to imagine every time. Splash, splash, splash." He put his arms up again. "It felt really good. You've just scored, you turn, and then splash, splash, splash." He looked at me and did another little laugh. All this time, I never told a single soul. I have no clue why that is so moving to me. I think it again speaks to like how intimate and like intricate the ties are between these characters. Every little reminder of their humanity makes the knife dig in deeper, of course, but also just like the way that these characters are written from like a craft perspective. It's all these tiny little things. Like, sharing a thought like that is such a small passive thing, and it's an act of intimacy that is so like radical. Like, yes, you can tell someone like all your trauma or whatever, and people love to go on the internet and share all their trauma. Does that mean that they're close with every single person who watched their trauma candy salad TikTok? No. But if you can turn to another human being and share a tiny little nonsense thought like that means that you are like so close. Like, every time I've had an instinct to share something like that with someone, it's like someone that I was very close with. And the way that is like used, he uses that as a way to say goodbye to her. And I think it's a perfect sort of acknowledgement of what they have with each other, like this real profound love that they have, without getting into like any flowery like greeting card sentiment. So yeah, I find it so beautiful. I'm literally gonna start crying. I find it so beautiful. I want to wrap this up by doing something that I like to call pop culture synesthesia, which is usually when I read a book, I can't help but think of like music. It reminds me of TV shows, other books, like characters, other things like that. So I want to share my pop culture synesthesia for Never Let Me Go. The first is music. I associate this book with the album OK Computer by Radiohead. It's British music. It's sort of melancholy and like yearning, and it has this like sort of dystopian edge to it. Obviously, it's a famous album. You should check it out if you haven't. So that's the music comp. I think this book has a film adaptation, and it has like a crazy stellar cast, including Andrew Garfield, and I'm probably gonna rewatch that tonight. I did watch it when I first finished the book. That was like 4 years ago. I remember it being pretty good, and like a pretty decent adaptation of this story. But if I had to think of other movies, I would think of like Wong Kar-wai movies. So I think specifically 2046, but you could say like almost any of them, like Happy Together or obviously In the Mood for Love. All of them have this sort of like doomed relationship and these explorations of like, what does it mean to be alive, and like what do we owe each other, and all this stuff. And they have like very similar emotional tones. And finally, I am obsessed with The Real Housewives of New York. It's like one of my favorite television programs ever to exist. And if I were a professor, I would easily design an entire English and media studies course around The Real Housewives. So I wanted to play a little game where I associated Tommy, Ruth, and Kath with 3 of The Real Housewives. For Kath, I'm gonna have to say Kath is too good of a person. But I'm going to go with Dorinda. I think she is very good at like, she really, really enjoys being able to be there for people and being able to take care of people. She does sometimes lash out, but she, for the most part, really loves playing the role of like hostess and like caretaker, and being an emotional rock for people. That like really, she loves that. For Tommy, I would say Ramona, because of like the random tantrums, but he's so much better than Ramona. But just for the random tantrums, we're gonna go with Ramona. Maybe more like Sonia, because he's sort of ditzy also. Yeah, we'll say Sonia. He has these random moments of like tantrum, but he is on the whole a sweetheart, and he is a little bit ditzy. And for Ruth, there's so many good options. Maybe Bethany. I don't know. Yeah, I'll go with Bethany. She's so shrewd. She's an incredible businesswoman, and very good at reading people and reading situations and taking control, sometimes to a fault, and she can go too far, and she really needs to be in control. Otherwise she just completely loses it. So that was a fun exercise. Yeah, I love this book, and I'm sure I'll read it again. And I think part of why I wanted to even make this video was like for myself, because I think every time I read this book, it's going to affect me differently. I'm going to see different things in it. Like, there's so many ways of looking at this book, and I barely even brushed over so many of them, and like, it's just so special. I think Ishiguro is very good at crafting narratives, crafting stories where people confront a lack of agency or missed opportunities to use agency in a way that I find more inspiring than like self-help books, like, because it is such a great reminder that like we do have some level of say in our own lives. Even though it's limited, it still matters. you do what you can with what you have, I guess, is basically how to sum it up. And it just, even like, that is like the note of hope in this like sad story. That's all I have to say about that. I'm gonna edit this and see if anything usable comes out of it, and if it does, I'm gonna probably put it on my YouTube channel. I really like this, so I'm probably gonna make more book videos, but who knows? So it depends how hard the editing is. Okay, goodbye.